She went down into a hole in the forest and disappeared. No one knew what was hidden underground. What she saw in the depths changed everything. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The forest had always been a place of quiet certainty for her, a landscape she had walked so many times that it seemed woven into the rhythm of her own life. She trusted its narrow paths and low, mossy hills, the way some people trusted their morning routines or the flicker of a porch light that had never gone out. For more than 20 years, she had used these wooded trails as a refuge from the numbing monotony of office work, stepping away from spreadsheets and fluorescent lights into a world where her heartbeat finally slowed into something she could bear. The years had given her a kind of seasoned confidence. She knew how to pack her bag without thinking, how to tie her boots so they would not blister, how to steady her breath as she climbed a slope. This forest had been her companion through breakups, job changes, illnesses, and recoveries. It was the one place she trusted, perhaps more than any person in her life. But as she stepped past the first line of trees that afternoon, she realized the forest had changed. A storm had rolled through 2 days earlier, a violent one with sheets of rain that slammed against her apartment windows and wind strong enough to rattle the door. Lightning had flashed over the hills, exposing the silhouettes of trembling branches, and she had wondered, briefly, how the old trees in her forest would endure. Now she saw the aftermath. Leaves were scattered in thick piles, branches broken under their own weight, and the familiar scent of pine had been replaced by the heavy musk of overturned soil. The ground still felt damp beneath her boots. Birds kept their distance, perched high in the trembling canopy, as if unsettled by the new order of things. She advanced slower than usual, listening to the dripping of water from leaf to leaf. The trail itself was different, subtly altered by runoff. A narrow gully ran alongside it, where rainwater had carved its impatient path downhill. The air felt colder, the shadows deeper. She had walked this exact route hundreds of times, but now she looked at every bend with the eyes of a stranger, searching for a sense of familiarity that refused to surface. She stopped when she reached the slope where the path curved sharply to the right. Something was wrong. The earth had slumped inwards, leaving a ragged depression where there had always been a smooth incline. At first, from several steps away, she assumed it was simply another fallen tree, or perhaps the trace of a small landslide. But as she approached cautiously, she saw that the collapse was deeper than she expected. A wide bowl carved abruptly into the ground. Its edges were uneven, still crumbling in small streams of sand, and the interior was dark, as if the earth had been scooped out rather than broken. She crouched near the rim, brushing loose debris aside. The soil was soft and cold. A shaft of weak afternoon light slipped across the interior of the depression, revealing an opening at its center, an unmistakable hollow descending into the ground. She leaned closer, squinting. It was not the irregular sort of hole she had seen dug by foxes or other small forest animals. It was too broad, too cleanly carved. The walls curved inward in a smooth arc, as though shaped deliberately by hands or tools rather than paws. Something about it made her pulse slow and deepen. She moved her hand over the soil again, feeling the texture of the outer rim. It had collapsed recently. Even the roots that protruded from the torn earth still held moisture. She picked up a fallen twig and carefully prodded the outermost edges of the opening. The structure held firm just beneath the surface. The soil was compacted, compressed in a way that suggested it had not been exposed to air for a very long time. The entrance itself seemed ancient, hidden until the storm tore away its cover. She hesitated. Curiosity nudged her forward, but caution pressed back against her ribs. She had read stories about sinkholes, about people swallowed by sudden ground failures, about old wells hidden beneath a thin crust of earth. She knew how dangerous it could be to approach an unknown cavity. Yet something about this hollow stirred her, a subtle insistence that what lay inside was not a natural formation. She felt that peculiar tug, the one that draws a person toward the unknown simply because it is unknown, because it promises an answer to a question they did not realize they were asking. She adjusted the straps of her backpack, switched on her flashlight, and angled the beam downward into the mouth of the tunnel. The light caught on the inner walls, illuminating compacted soil etched with faint, parallel lines. They ran horizontally in some places, vertically in others, like the remnants of old digging marks. The more she studied them, the more certain she became that they hadn't been made by claws. They were too deliberate in their spacing, too similar to the shallow cuts left by metal or sharpened wood. A soft chill moved through her as she leaned closer. The light traveled deeper, revealing the tunnel sloping at a gentle downward angle, disappearing into darkness. The air that rose from the hole was cool, but not stale. That surprised her. If this had been sealed underground for decades, the air should have been stagnant. Instead, there was a faint freshness, as though another opening existed somewhere far below. She told herself she would only examine the entrance, nothing more. She would stay close, avoid anything risky, and satisfy her curiosity before moving on. But as she lowered one foot into the entrance, using the unbroken edge as a brace, she felt the familiar quiet of the forest fade behind her. Her breath quickened slightly. The tunnel swallowed the sound of her movements, muting everything except the steady tap of her boot against the packed soil. The light of the forest receded behind her as she descended a few careful steps, angling her flashlight along the curve of the passage. The slope was manageable, the walls broad enough for her to move without stooping. Her boots pressed into the cool, firm earth, leaving temporary impressions that seemed to disappear almost immediately, as if the ground breathed them back in. The deeper she went, the more the tunnel revealed of itself. The walls were smooth enough to suggest human effort, but irregular enough to hint at great age. She swept her light along the surface, watching it catch on a shallow groove carved at shoulder height, running parallel to the tunnel's descent. It was too straight to be accidental. She paused, studying its length. It could have been a guide mark, an organizing line for workers, or simply a reinforcing cut. Whatever its purpose, it confirmed one thing. Someone had made this passage. The slope became gentler after several meters, leveling into a narrow corridor that stretched into shadow. She took a slow breath and glanced back over her shoulder. The entrance was still visible behind her, though now it appeared smaller, framed by uneven earth. A faint triangle of daylight remained, muted by the dust and debris stirred by her descent. She could still turn back with ease, still convince herself to climb out and leave the mystery untouched. Yet the stillness ahead held her fast. Something about the tunnel's quiet order, the deliberate structure beneath the raw soil, felt significant, as though she had stumbled onto a forgotten chapter of the forest's history. She advanced a little farther, her footsteps crisp in the silence. The air shifted subtly, carrying a hint of moisture and a distant dripping sound. She turned her light toward the tunnel floor and saw faint traces of decay. Slivers of wood, too aged to identify, embedded in the dirt like fallen teeth. Some appeared blackened, as though burned long ago. She imagined torches held here once, illuminating the same path she walked now. When she raised her flashlight again, she noticed a pattern of shallow indentations on the left, wall-short strokes, angled diagonally, repeating across the surface. They reminded her of tally marks, the kind carved to count days or steps or something else significant to the people who made them. The realization tightened something in her chest. These were not random scratches. They were messages, markers, breadcrumbs from a vanished time. She lowered her hand to the wall, letting her fingers hover just above the surface. The earth felt cool and steady, as though it had been waiting centuries to be touched again. She wondered who had walked these tunnels last, what purpose they served, how deeply they extended beneath the forest she believed she knew. A faint tremor ran through the soil. She froze, holding her breath. A soft, crumbling sound drifted from somewhere behind her. She turned quickly, raising her flashlight toward the entrance. The triangle of sunlight flickered as loose dirt tumbled down from the rim, narrowing the gap. She took a small step backward, her heartbeat rising. The collapse was minor, nowhere near enough to trap her, but it was a warning. The ground above was unstable, reshaped by the storm. If she stayed too long, the earth might not let her leave so easily. The forest, with all its familiar paths and gentle solitude, seemed far away now, separated from her by more than just a few meters of earth. She stood alone in a space carved by hands long dead, in a corridor shaped by choices she could no longer witness. And yet the pull of discovery overrode her fear. She felt in a quiet and unshakable way that she was standing at the threshold of something significant, something the storm had uncovered not by accident, but by inevitability. She turned her light back toward the darkened passage stretching ahead. The walls glistened faintly where moisture seeped through the soil. The tunnel breathed a cold, steady silence. She tightened her grip on the flashlight, steadied her breath, and took another step forward, leaving behind the dim glow of daylight for whatever waited in the depths of the earth. The light behind her dwindled into a pale memory as she continued her descent, giving way to a deeper silence that settled over her like a second layer of earth. It was no longer possible to pretend that she was simply examining an exposed pocket of soil or some unusual geological formation. The tunnel stretching before her bore undeniable signs of intention. Each step she took pressed her more firmly into a world where the forest above became unreal, a place she had once known, but that no longer had any direct connection to where she now walked. The ground felt different here, firmer in some areas, looser in others, its texture shifting with each slow advancement. Somewhere behind her, soil still shifted from the earlier collapse, a subtle reminder that the world above was unstable and that her exit was no longer guaranteed. She tried not to think about that. Instead, she focused on the dim corridor ahead and the distant, steady dripping that echoed like a metronome in the otherwise suffocating quiet. As she moved deeper, the tunnel began to change. The walls widened slightly, then narrowed again, forming a series of uneven chambers connected by sloping passages. In one such widening, her flashlight revealed a branching of paths, 3 separate corridors diverging like the roots of a tree. One angled upward, disappearing into a jagged cleft. Another sloped downward toward thicker darkness. The third extended almost horizontally, curving gently out of sight. The sight of these intersecting paths stirred both awe and apprehension within her. The forest above had never hinted at such complexity beneath its soil. How many years, how many centuries had these tunnels waited unseen, hidden beneath the roots and the moss? The air here felt stiller, more contemplative, as if the tunnels themselves held memories she could not access. She approached the first junction cautiously, sweeping her flashlight across the walls. It was there that she noticed the small recess in the earth. At first, she thought it was just another indentation, eroded by time. But the light picked up something different, a faint glimmer, not of metal, but of glossy, smooth stone. She crouched, brushing away compacted dust with her gloved hand. Beneath the surface lay several fragmented pieces of fired clay, unmistakably shards of a vessel. Their edges were rounded by age, their surfaces coated with a film of dirt. One piece held the faint trace of a pattern, a curved line etched into its surface. It was nothing ornate, just a suggestion of a design, but it ignited her imagination with its spark of recognition. This was not random debris swept underground by erosion. It was the remnant of something crafted, something human. She moved the light farther into the recess and found small, charred pieces of wood, faintly blackened splinters that crumbled at her touch. She imagined that long ago, in some forgotten era, someone had stood where she knelt now, perhaps with a flickering flame, casting shadows on these same walls. The idea was eerie, but it also grounded her. These tunnels had a human past. She was not in a place shaped by some unknowable force, but in the remnants of an old passage carved by people who had their own reasons for digging down into the earth. That thought steadied her enough to stand, though the heaviness in the air reminded her she was far from safe. She turned her attention back to the branching paths. Her first instinct was to choose the most level option, the one that looked easiest to navigate. But when she stepped toward it, she noticed more marks etched into the wall, long, straight strokes, their placement too intentional to be the work of any animal. They lined the curve of the tunnel, running in a pattern that could have been a guide, or perhaps a record. The marks were too numerous to count quickly, and their purpose remained concealed in the silence. She ran her fingertips near them, not quite touching. They were neither decorative nor chaotic. They were functional. Someone had carved these with a goal in mind. She backed away slowly, choosing instead to follow the downward-sloping passage. It seemed the sound of water came from somewhere below, and water often meant a larger cavity, possibly a more stable chamber. Her flashlight revealed more wooden splinters embedded in the floor as she descended, along with rocks that appeared to have been shaped or chipped. Everything she saw reinforced her growing conviction that this place had once been a constructed environment, rather than the accidental hollow she had first suspected. She imagined ancient hands working tirelessly in the semi-darkness, carving out a refuge or a storage place, leaving behind traces that time had nearly swallowed. As she continued, the air thickened. She caught herself breathing harder, instinctively drawing deeper breaths that felt insufficient. She paused and pressed a hand to the cool wall, feeling the slight tremor in her own fingers. Hypoxia, she realized. She had read about its effects in survival guides, how stale or low oxygen air could cause confusion, dizziness, even hallucinations. The air was not unbreathable here, but it was different from what she was used to. Heavier, less replenished. The faint breeze she had felt near the entrance seemed to disappear as she reached deeper into the earth. She told herself she needed to stay alert, to conserve energy and move slowly. But moving slowly did not reduce the unsettling sense that the air was closing in around her. The tunnel narrowed ahead, forcing her to angle her body sideways as she advanced. The sound of dripping water grew more pronounced, each drop hitting the ground with a loud, hollow echo that tricked her into imagining movement in the darkness. Her flashlight beam shook slightly as she lifted it to examine the walls. More marks, more grooves, and she stopped, holding the light steady a space in the wall where stones had been removed, leaving behind a pocket of emptiness. Within this shallow cavity, she spotted bones. Her breath caught in her throat. The bones were small, arranged neatly rather than scattered. The remains of small animals. Rabbits. Birds were stacked in a way that seemed almost deliberate. At first, the rational part of her mind assumed they had belonged to a predator that used this recess as a hiding place. But the neatness unsettled her. Predators did not sort their kills. They ate them, left scraps, moved on. These bones were organized, perhaps as a way to store food or as a result of habit. She pictured someone, a long time ago, collecting remains for tools or rituals. She could imagine the flicker of a flame illuminating these pale fragments, the scrape of stone against bone. The image made her stomach tighten. She forced herself to move on. She needed to keep her mind grounded in logic. in the fact that everything she had found so far could be explained by human activity and the steady erosion of time. The tunnels narrowed once again, and she found herself squeezing between two converging walls, her body pressed so tightly that she felt the scrape of soil through her clothing. The weight of the earth seemed to press in from all sides. She tried to steady her breathing, but the air felt insufficient. Each inhale felt shallower than the one before, and her heartbeat thudded loudly in her ears. A sense of disorientation pulled at her as she emerged from the narrow passage into a slightly wider corridor. She paused, shining her flashlight across the ground. She saw prints, faint but unmistakably human, pressed into the soft dirt. Her first thought was that they might be her own, but the shape was wrong. These prints were smaller, uneven, as though made by someone walking barefoot and unsteadily. Some toes dug deeper than others. One print appeared almost doubled, as if the person had stumbled. Suddenly, the tunnel felt alive, inhabited not only by memories, but by something recent, something that had passed through here within the last months, perhaps even weeks. She tried to calm herself. The rational explanation was that someone had explored these tunnels before her, maybe a hiker or an adventurous child from a nearby town. But she could not recall ever hearing stories of underground passages in this forest. She knew the area well, local legends, historical anecdotes, even geological notes, and nothing had ever mentioned something like this. Whoever had been here before her, she realized, had entered these tunnels without the rest of the world noticing. She continued down the corridor, following the faint prints until they reached another chamber. Her flashlight exposed another cluster of remnants fabric scraps, an old tin container crushed nearly flat, and what looked like a piece of leather worn almost smooth. She examined it closely, noticing the stitching along one edge. It looked like part of a shoe. It was too out of place to ignore. The fabric scraps were too modern to be relics of ancient tunnel dwellers. These were signs of someone who might still be alive, or someone who had been alive long after the tunnel's creators had vanished. The air thickened even more as she lingered in the chamber, reminding her that time was not on her side. She felt the onset of dizziness, a slight buzzing in her ears. She knew she needed to keep moving, to find a source of fresh air, to avoid succumbing to the effects of low oxygen. But as she prepared to leave, her flashlight caught something else movement, or what she thought might be movement. She held her breath, turning the beam toward the source. The space beyond the chamber seemed to inhale and exhale with a faint sound, a rhythmic, uneven noise she could not immediately identify. It had the cadence of breathing, but too distorted to be certain. Her heart hammered harder now, sending tremors down her arms. The noise came again, slightly louder, echoing off the tunnel walls. She felt the instinctive urge to retreat, but she reminded herself that the way back had already been compromised. Even if she turned back now, the path to the entrance was unstable and possibly blocked further by continuing soil shifts. Staying in place was not an option. Moving forward toward the unknown sound was the only choice she had if she wanted any hope of finding a safer chamber, another exit, or at least a pocket of fresher air. She stood at the threshold of the next corridor, her flashlight shaking in her hand. The sound pulsed again, a rough whisper of breath mixed with the rasp of something dragging faintly along stone. It was not the moan of airflow she had occasionally heard in caves or abandoned spaces. This sound carried weight, intention. She forced herself to inhale slowly, fighting the rising panic that clawed at the back of her throat. She knew that the mind, deprived of oxygen, could play tricks. It could turn small sounds into threats, shadows into figures, breathing into something sinister. Still, she sensed that what she was hearing was real. She tightened her grip on her flashlight and took a careful step forward. The tunnel ahead was darker than any she had walked through so far, its walls angling inward slightly, forming a narrowing throat that led into deeper obscurity. The sound came again, resonating through the walls like a heartbeat. She steadied herself and prepared to descend into whatever waited beyond the curve, knowing that there was no turning back, now that the forest above, the sunlight, the familiar world she once trusted, had dissolved behind her, leaving only this labyrinth of earth and echoes. She took another step, then another. The breathing sound grew louder, more distinct, and with the next breath, she heard it clearly. Someone, or something, was alive in the depths of the tunnel. She continued forward, compelled not by curiosity anymore, but by necessity, moving toward the source of that uneven breath, knowing it would lead her deeper into the truth of the labyrinth, deeper into the heart of a story the earth had kept hidden for far too long. The sound of breathing guided her deeper, each uneven exhale echoing along the curved walls, as if the tunnel itself were inhaling and exhaling in time with the unseen figure ahead. The thick, stale air clawed at her lungs with every step she took, and she felt her pulse thumping at the base of her throat. Still, she moved forward, compelled not by curiosity alone, but by the growing certainty that whatever waited in the darkness was real, and that confronting it was the only path left open to her. The tunnel narrowed suddenly, funneling her into a passage so tight that she had to angle her shoulders to pass through. Her flashlight beam jittered as her hands trembled, the light spilling across the floor where she saw faint impressions pressed into the soft earth. She froze. They were footprints, bare, uneven, smaller than hers. The sight held her stiff for a moment before she forced her breath out, focusing on what she saw instead of what her fear wanted her to imagine. The prints were not old. The edges were still defined, the soil not yet crumbled back into itself. Someone had passed through recently, perhaps only days before. She crouched, tracing the outline of a print with the beam of her light. The gait was irregular. One foot pressed deeper than the other, and in several places she noticed smudges where the toes slipped sideways, suggesting a staggering movement. Whoever made these prints had not been steady on their feet. The knowledge struck her with a mix of dread and reluctant empathy. She pictured a person injured, lost, wandering these tunnels alone, breathing the same thinning air she struggled with now. The thought pushed her onward, though part of her wished she could turn her back on the prints, on the breathing, on everything that had pulled her into this underground maze. The corridor constricted further, forcing her to sink to her knees. The earth scraped along her backpack, catching on its straps, threatening to pin her if she shifted her weight wrong. She pushed forward slowly, listening to the whisper of soil showering down in tiny grains above her. It felt as though the entire ceiling hovered inches from collapse. Her breath fogged faintly in front of her, creating a thin veil that clung to the cold air. Her arms burned as she braced against the walls, inching ahead. The breathing sound seemed closer now, amplified by the narrow confines and vibrating along the floor beneath her hands. She dragged herself forward until the narrow throat of the passage opened, without warning, into a small chamber. The sudden sense of space made her gasp, though the air was no fresher here than before. She rose unsteadily onto her feet, sweeping her light around the room. The ceiling was higher, uneven but stable. The walls rounded where old tools or hands had shaped them. The floor bore scattered remnants of human presence, a bundle of cloth that might once have been clothing, now deteriorated beyond recognition, a flattened tin that had rusted along its edges, and a makeshift bed constructed from an assortment of rags, leaves, and even thin strips of bark. She stepped closer, her eyes following the arrangement of the bed. It was not something ancient. The leaves were not brittle with age, but only slightly wilted. The cloth bore the fading colors of modern fabric. Someone had slept here recently. She shone her flashlight across the ground again and noticed a small metal bowl, dented and tarnished, its interior coated with a dried residue that looked like a mixture of dirt and something once liquid. A shudder rippled across her spine as she took in each item. This was not a ruin left behind centuries ago. It was a living space crude, fragile, and inhabited by someone who had endured much more time underground than she could imagine surviving. Her flashlight caught on another object near the far wall, a piece of leather, worn smooth in one place and torn in another. She lifted it carefully with 2 fingers. It was a piece of a shoe, not ancient, not even particularly old. Stitching still visible despite the damage. The sole was missing, ripped free, or decayed beyond recognition. She lowered it slowly, her mind racing through possibilities. Whoever lived here had not entered the tunnels prepared. They had likely stumbled into them the way she had, through a collapse or a hidden opening, and had been unable to find their way back out. Her chest tightened as she imagined the desperation of someone trapped in the dark for days, weeks, possibly months. The breathing pulled her attention again. It came from the far end of the chamber, where another narrow passage led deeper into the earth. The sound was louder now, more distinct, undeniably human. A mixture of dread and determination pushed her forward. She moved carefully, stepping over the makeshift bed, mindful not to disturb anything more than she had to. The ground sloped slightly downward as she crossed the room. She aimed her light into the passage and saw a figure hunched against the wall. For a moment, her brain refused to process what she was seeing. The silhouette was motionless except for the shallow rise and fall of its chest. When her flashlight beam reached the figure, it flinched violently, raising thin, dirt-crusted hands to shield its face. She froze, her breath caught mid-inhale. The figure trembled as though expecting harm, its breathing ragged and quickened. Slowly, as if coaxing a frightened animal, she lowered the beam of her flashlight toward the floor. The dimmer light seemed to ease the figure's panic slightly. Its hands fell just enough for her to see the outline of a gaunt face, hollowed by time and deprivation, eyes sunken in their sockets, hair matted and tangled against the scalp. He looked like a man. He looked like a man who had been down here far too long. He was thin, dangerously so. His limbs reduced to sinewy cords beneath skin, coated with a film of dirt and soot. His clothing, what remained of it, hung in tatters, no longer serving any real purpose. His feet were bare, cracked, caked in grime. He drew another shaky breath, leaning heavily against the wall, as though the effort of standing or sitting upright would have been too much. She felt her pulse quicken with a different kind of urgency now, a fear not of him, but for him. The air here was barely breathable. If he had survived this long, it was only by some fragile thread. He tried to speak, his mouth opening as if to form words, but only a hoarse, broken sound emerged. She stepped closer, and he recoiled against the wall. But there was no strength behind the movement. It was instinct, the reflex of someone who had learned to fear everything, even light. She swallowed hard, aware that any sudden movement could startle him further. Aware, too, that she needed to understand what he endured to understand her own fate. She studied his face, searching for clues, age, identity, desperation. He appeared middle-aged, but prematurely aged by hardship. His skin bore scratches and bruises, some old and faded, others more recent. She wondered how he had come to be here. A missing hiker? A local man who had wandered too far from safety? Someone suffering from an emotional or psychological break who sought isolation? The possibilities ran through her mind, each one plausible and yet insufficient to explain the profound loneliness etched into his expression. She remembered the fragments she had found, the shredded shoe, the rusted tin, the bed of leaves. All signs pointed not only to his presence, but to his extended struggle. He had carved out a life in the suffocating dark, living among remnants of ancient tunnels without any support from the world above. She took another cautious step forward, trying to project calm despite the pounding of her heart. His breathing grew sharper, and she could see the twitch of fear in his limbs. The tunnel offered no room for deception. If she frightened him, he could react unpredictably. If she moved too slowly, he could lose consciousness or fail to understand her harmless intentions. She kept her distance, giving him space. For long moments, they simply stared at one another, she with cautious sympathy, he with a haunted wariness that spoke of unspeakable solitude. The earth groaned softly above them, a deep, resonant sound that vibrated through the floor. She stiffened. The man flinched and curled slightly inward, as though accustomed to such tremors. Dust drifted down in a faint cloud. She realized with chilling clarity that they were not only deep underground, they were in an unstable section of the labyrinth. The earlier collapses were not isolated incidents. The storm above had disturbed the land, and the tunnels, ancient as they were, could fail at any time. She turned her head instinctively toward the passageway behind her, imagining the path back to the previous chamber, to the entrance, to the now vanished triangle of daylight. She knew with certainty that she could not retrace her steps. Too much soil had shifted. Too many narrow passages stood on the verge of collapse. She was trapped in this subterranean world just as the man had been, with only one direction left to explore. The realization settled into her like a stone. But unlike him, she still had strength, mobility, and a functioning flashlight. She could move. She could search. She could try to find a way out. Another tremor rolled through the chamber with sudden violence. This time, the ground shuddered sharply, followed by a cracking pop as a portion of the tunnel ceiling broke free somewhere behind her. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space. She turned in time to see a plume of dust erupt from the passage she had crawled through minutes earlier. The collapse continued in a chain reaction, each shifting section disturbing the next, until the entire passage was sealed by a mound of fallen earth. She felt panic rising through her, hot and sharp, but she forced it back down. The way was blocked. There was no undoing it, no digging through tons of earth by hand. The only path remaining was forward, deeper into the labyrinth, toward whatever exit might exist, if any did. The man stirred slightly, his breathing fast and shallow. He sensed the danger, too. She realized that for all his fear, he depended on her now. He had lived here long enough to survive day after day, but not without consequence. His energy was nearly gone. His instincts were raw. He needed her strength as much as she needed information about the labyrinth from him, even if he was too weak or too frightened to communicate. She moved closer, kneeling slowly so he could see her face clearly in the dim light. She kept her motions deliberate, gentle. He did not recoil this time. His eyes remained fixed on her flashlight, mesmerized or overwhelmed by its glow. She lowered it again to reduce the strain on his eyes, and then extended a hand, not touching him, only offering. He stared at it for a long moment, his breathing ragged. Then, with a hesitant, trembling motion, he lifted his own hand, just enough for her to take it lightly. The contact was brief, but enough to convey his fragile trust. She stood carefully, encouraging him to follow. He attempted to rise but faltered, his legs unable to bear his weight. She reached for his arm, guiding him gently. He leaned heavily against her as he stood, a frail silhouette struggling against exhaustion. The moment he straightened, the stale air seemed to thicken even more. She felt the onset of dizziness wash over her again. They could not stay in this chamber. It was too deep, too poorly ventilated. They needed to find a higher or more open section. With one arm supporting the weakened man, she turned toward the only remaining passage leading out of the chamber. The breathing sound behind her began to fade as they moved, not because it had ceased, but because the rhythm of their own breaths now filled the narrow corridor. She took a single step into the new passage, guiding him with her, and felt the faintest touch of air brush against her cheek. It was enough to give her hope that somewhere ahead, beyond the darkness and the weight of the earth, another exit existed. She tightened her grip on his arm and continued forward, deeper into the labyrinth that had swallowed them both, unaware of how long the journey would be or what new dangers waited in the unseen corridors ahead. The air shifted almost imperceptibly as she stepped into the narrow passage, guiding the weakened man beside her. It was such a faint movement, as delicate as a sigh brushing past her cheek, yet it stirred something sharp and determined inside her. If air was moving, then space existed somewhere ahead, an opening, a fissure, a path that led to an area less suffocating than the chamber behind them. She held on to that realization with the same desperate instinct that made her tighten her grip on the man's arm, steadying him as he stumbled forward. She could feel the tremors in his body, the slight spasms of exhausted muscles struggling to obey commands. His breath rattled unevenly, and each inhale seemed to fight against the heavy atmosphere pressing down on them. The passage sloped downward at first, and she felt a moment of doubt. Down often meant deeper danger, lower oxygen, more risk. But the faint current of air brushed against her skin again, and though she could not identify its direction with absolute certainty, she sensed that following the path ahead was the only viable option left to them. Behind them lay collapse, darkness, and suffocation. Ahead lay a possibility, however small. She moved carefully, one slow step after another, supporting the man's weight when his knees buckled beneath him. The walls seemed to pulse with shadows as her flashlight beam wavered with each movement of her hand. Her lungs felt strained, as though they had to work twice as hard to gather breath from the thinning air. She forced herself to focus on the fundamentals. Inhale slowly, exhale fully, conserve strength. The man beside her did not have that discipline. His breathing was erratic, fast, shallow. Several times she feared he might collapse entirely, but each time he managed to take one more step. The tunnel floor became uneven, marked by dips and rises, shaped by ancient erosion or shifting earth. She stumbled once, catching herself against the wall, her fingers sinking into a small pocket of loose soil. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and she closed her eyes for a moment, commanding her body to stabilize. When she opened them again, the man was leaning heavily against her shoulder. His head drooped, as though sleep threatened to claim him even while standing. They continued on until the faint movement of air grew stronger, swirling around them with a subtle but unmistakable insistence. She raised her flashlight and saw the passage widening just ahead. Her heart lifted. Space meant circulation, and circulation meant oxygen. She urged the man forward with renewed determination, sliding her hand to the center of his back to guide him more securely. The tunnel opened into a sloping cavern, its ceiling stretching higher than any chamber they had yet encountered. She felt the difference immediately. The air, while still cool and stale, carried a thin freshness that her starved lungs recognized like a forgotten memory. She inhaled deeply. Still not enough. Still strained, but enough to steady her mind and clear the fuzziness pressing in at the edges of her consciousness. The man sagged forward, nearly falling to his knees, and she helped lower him gently to the ground. His chest rose and fell in quick, ragged bursts. She knelt beside him, letting the flashlight rest on her lap as she steadied his shoulders. His eyes fluttered beneath heavy lids, unfocused, but not yet lost. She saw, for the first time, fear mixed with something else. Trust, fragile and tentative, born of necessity. She whispered nothing, for words were useless here. Instead, she adjusted his posture so he could breathe more easily, and then lifted the flashlight to study their surroundings. The cavern was vast compared to the narrow passages they had crawled through. The ceiling arched unevenly, shaped by time and water, while the floor slanted downward in a gradual incline. Patches of dry earth suggested that moisture did not pool here often, a good sign that the walls were stable, but the cavern was far from inviting. Jagged protrusions jutted from the walls, and the shadows they cast seemed to shift subtly with every movement of light. She forced herself to stand, her legs trembling beneath her. The air was thin even here, but it was livable. She needed to explore, needed to find where the air came from, needed to confirm that escape was not a fantasy conjured by her oxygen-starved mind. She walked to the edge of the cavern, taking care not to venture so far that she lost sight of the man. Her flashlight beam swept across the slanted floor until it caught something, a series of faint scuff marks etched into the dirt. They were not as deliberate as the carvings on the walls of the earlier chambers, nor as defined as the footprints she had followed before. These marks told a different story. Someone had dragged themselves across this space recently, perhaps many times, perhaps out of desperation. She followed the marks with the beam of her light until they disappeared into another passage on the far side of the cavern. The opening was narrow, but wide enough for her to squeeze through. She approached cautiously, feeling a sharp bite of colder air against her skin. That subtle chill gave her pause. Cold air behaved differently underground. It did not settle randomly. Temperature changes meant movement, and movement meant access to the surface. Her pulse quickened slightly. If this passage carried cold air, then it might lead toward an exit, or at least toward a place where the air was less stagnant and more survivable. She returned to the man crouching beside him. He looked up at her weakly, his eyes reflecting the dim glow from her light. She helped him to his feet again, knowing the journey ahead would demand the last reserves of endurance from both of them. He leaned heavily into her as they crossed the cavern. Even the short distance seemed to exhaust him. His feet dragged, his head lolled forward. She whispered encouragement under her breath. Not words for him, but words for herself, to keep the rising panic at bay. They reached the narrow passage, and she angled her body to enter first, guiding him behind her. The walls were rougher here, shaped less by tools and more by natural fractures in the earth. The ground sloped downward sharply, and she had to brace herself with her free hand as she descended. The air thickened briefly, but then she felt it again. That faint, cool breath of moving air brushing her cheek. She followed it like a lifeline. The passage soon opened into another chamber, smaller, rounder, with walls that curved inward toward a tight opening in the floor. She approached the opening and aimed her flashlight downward. The beam revealed a steep drop, not vertical but close, formed by a collapse that had created a funnel-shaped slide. Loose soil and smooth stone combined to form an unstable slope that led into darkness. Yet from this opening, the cool airflow was unmistakable. It rose steadily, brushing past her face, bringing with it the faintest scent of moisture and something else, perhaps moss, perhaps roots, perhaps the forest above. Hope and dread collided violently in her chest. This descent would be dangerous. The slope was steep and unpredictable. If they slipped uncontrollably, they could fall into a pocket of airless earth or into an even deeper part of the labyrinth. But if they stayed where they were, hypoxia would claim them long before anyone noticed they were missing. She studied the slope carefully, evaluating every uneven surface, every potential foothold or handhold. The old beams and scraps of cloth she had gathered from earlier chambers were still in her pack. She could use them. She had to. She moved quickly but carefully, retrieving the longest piece of wood she had found and testing its strength. It was brittle in places but solid enough if used carefully. She tied a strip of fabric around one end, creating a makeshift grip. Then she anchored another piece of cloth around a sturdy outcropping of rock near the entrance of the slope, fashioning a crude tether. It would not stop a fall, but it could slow one. The man watched her with weary eyes, confusion flickering across his expression as she prepared the descent. She approached him again, placing a hand on his arm and lowering her voice instinctively, though neither of them had the breath to waste on words. He seemed to understand her intent. Fear tightened his features, but he did not resist when she positioned him at the edge of the slope. She went first. She braced her boots against the nearest stable points of the slope, testing each shift of her weight. The soil slid in small streams beneath her, but she controlled her descent by gripping the makeshift pole and using her free hand to press against the walls of the narrow chute. The air grew colder as she moved downward. Each breath felt deeper, cleaner. A thrill of relief shot through her, momentarily easing the strain in her chest. When she found a small ledge partway down, she stopped, looked up, and motioned for the man to begin his descent. He hesitated at the edge before sliding down slowly, his limbs trembling. She guided him verbally as best she could, telling him where to reach, where to place his foot, how to shift his weight. Twice he slipped, sending soil cascading downward. The second time she lunged upward to steady him, grabbing his wrist and pulling him against the wall. Sweat dripped down her temple as she fought to stabilize both of them. They resumed the descent, moving inch by inch until the slope leveled out abruptly. She stumbled slightly, but caught herself on the wall. The man collapsed onto his knees the moment the ground allowed it. She kneeled beside him, panting hard, but relief washed through her. The air was different here. Cold, crisp, and undeniably alive. She could smell dampness, the mineral scent of stone touched by running water, and something else that made her pulse leap. The faint, unmistakable smell of open space. She stood again, helping the man rise. Ahead, the new passage curved, widening into what looked like the mouth of a larger chamber. She guided him forward, each step lighter than the one before. The air grew brighter, not by much, but enough that her flashlight beam became slightly washed out at its edges. She felt the hairs on her arms rise. Light meant possibility. Light meant life. They rounded the curve, and there it was, a fissure in the ceiling, jagged and narrow, but wide enough for faint daylight to seep through. Thin rays of muted gray filtered into the chamber, illuminating the rock walls with a ghostly radiance. She stared upward, breathless. The fissure was several feet above them, partially clogged with roots and debris. But it was real. It was a connection to the surface. She scrambled forward, lifting her flashlight to examine the edges of the fissure. The roots looked thick and tangled, but not impassable. Soil rested loosely in some places. A small shaft extended upward, slanted enough that climbing it might be possible with careful effort. She reached out to test one of the roots. It held firm. She turned back to the man. His face was lifted toward the faint light, his eyes glassy with disbelief. She touched his shoulder gently, and then gestured toward the opening. She would go first, establish handholds, clear what she could, and then help him follow. She began the climb, gripping roots and protrusions of stone. Soil showered down on her with each movement, but the roots held. When she reached the narrowest part of the shaft, she braced herself and pushed upward, forcing her shoulders through, then her torso, then finally dragging her legs behind her as she hauled herself onto the forest floor. Light enveloped her. Real light. The muted glow of late afternoon filtered through trees. Wind brushed her face, cool and steady. She was above ground. The sky was visible through the canopy pale, washed out, but vast compared to the suffocating ceilings below. For a moment, she simply lay there, gasping, letting her lungs fill with clean air. Then she rolled onto her stomach and reached back into the fissure. The man struggled, but she coaxed him upward, guiding his hands, gripping his wrists, pulling when he slipped. He wedged his foot against a root and heaved himself upward with what little strength he had left. She reached further, bracing herself, pulling him into the fresh air. His body collapsed against the forest floor beside her, trembling with exhaustion but alive. They lay there together for several minutes, breathing deeply, taking in the sounds of rustling leaves and distant birds. The earth beneath them was firm and warm in comparison to the cold, oppressive soil below. The air was a blessing. The forest quiet, but alive felt like a miracle. When she finally sat up, she looked back at the fissure. It was nearly invisible from above, hidden by fallen branches and moss. Anyone could walk past without noticing. The labyrinth beneath the forest was a world designed to be forgotten, sealed by time and accident. But now she knew it was there, and she knew others needed to know too. She helped the man sit upright. He looked weak, fragile, but he was breathing the clean air with an expression that was almost peaceful. She would get him help. She would call the authorities. She would tell them everything: the tunnels, the artifacts, the hidden chambers, and the man who had survived in the dark far longer than anyone should have. The forest had revealed its secret, and now, standing before the fissure that had nearly become her grave, she understood that some secrets were meant to be uncovered, not for glory or curiosity, but because they bridged the silent space between survival and despair, because they connected the living to the forgotten, because they reminded her that beneath the familiar paths she had walked for so many years, entire worlds existed where light seldom reached, waiting for someone to find them. She rose slowly, helped the man to his feet, and together they began the long walk towards safety, leaving behind the hidden labyrinth that had held them captive, yet had also, in its own strange way, given them back their lives. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Watch our other videos for more stories like this, and share this one with someone who'll appreciate it.